The year was 1828. A 19-year-old country boy stepped off a flatboat into the loud, massive city of New Orleans. For a young man who had only known the quiet woods and small villages, the towering brick buildings and giant ships resting in the docks were absolutely spellbinding. But as he walked deeper into the city market, the wonder turned into a nightmare. He witnessed a scene that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He saw helpless human beings bound together in heavy iron chains, being dragged off ships. They were being bought and sold like ordinary pieces of property. Paper flyers were plastered across the walls, advertising the auction of slaves and strictly telling buyers to bring cash. The teenager watched in horror as families were torn apart. The cruelty sickened him, but he was just a poor, hired boat worker. He had no money and no power to help them. Yet, as he watched the slaves being marched away, he turned to a friend and made a quiet, dangerous promise. He swore that someday he would stop this evil trade. But to do that, he would need to become the most powerful man in America. This boy was Abraham Lincoln, and the road to keeping that promise would be paved with a lifetime of crushing failures. To understand how strong Lincoln had to be, you have to look at the brutal reality of where he started. When Abraham was only 9 years old, his mother died in agony after drinking milk from a cow that had eaten a poisonous herb. His father, a harsh and demanding man, quickly brought home a stepmother. Thankfully, Abraham built a warm relationship with her, but his bond with his father was entirely broken. His father did not understand Abraham at all. He would openly mock and even beat his son, furious that the boy preferred reading books over doing backbreaking farm work. Lincoln never had the chance to get a proper, formal education. He never even fully understood mathematics. Instead, he taught himself to read and write. He would sit by the fire at night, memorizing passages from the Bible and the plays of William Shakespeare. He was an awkward-looking young man with unusually rough, unwanted cuts on his face. He shot up to an incredible 6 feet, 4 inches tall, with a thick country accent that made him sound unpolished. But he had one massive gift. He was an incredible storyteller. In his early 20s, Lincoln moved to a tiny frontier town called New Salem, sitting on the banks of the Sangamon River. It was a small settlement of only about 100 people. He took a job working as a clerk in a small wooden general store, selling candles, tools, and small bottles of wine. But times were hard. The store lost money, the owner was forced to close it, and Lincoln was fired. This was his first real failure, but during his time at the store, he earned something far more valuable than a paycheck. He earned the absolute trust of the town. One evening, a woman bought some items from the store. After she left, Lincoln realized his weighing scales had been slightly off. He had not given her the proper amount of goods. Most people would have ignored it. But Lincoln locked up the shop and walked a long distance to hand the woman the rest of her items. From that day forward, the people of New Salem called him Honest Abe. Banking on that reputation for total honesty, a 23-year-old Lincoln decided to run for the state assembly in 1832. He was confident his neighbors would vote for him. But when the results came in, he lost. It was his second major failure, leaving him completely broke and struggling just to find enough food to eat. Desperate to survive, he took any job he could find. He swung an axe as a logger, delivered letters as a postman, and worked part-time as a land surveyor. But it wasn't enough. Needing to make a name for himself, he used his massive height and strength to challenge New Salem's toughest wrestling champion, a man named Jack Armstrong. Lincoln lost the wrestling match, though some say he lost on purpose just to win the crowd's sympathy. Regardless, he fought so bravely that Armstrong and his rough crowd of friends respected him instantly. They became his most loyal supporters and helped launch his future political career. Hoping to finally fix his financial problems, Lincoln partnered with a friend named William Berry to open their own store. It was a total disaster. The business failed miserably, leaving Lincoln with a massive, crushing debt of $1,800. It took him 15 long years to pay it off, a burden he used to jokingly call his national debt. Finally, in 1834, his luck seemed to turn. He ran for the state assembly again and won. It was his first real taste of success in a life full of defeats. He was paid an allowance of just $3 a day. But this small victory was quickly overshadowed by the darkest, most painful year of his life. In 1835, his former business partner William Berry died. Then, a deadly wave of typhoid fever swept through the area. During his time in New Salem, Lincoln had fallen deeply in love with a beautiful young woman named Anne Rutledge. They had spent countless hours together, meeting outside the store and walking by the river. But Anne caught the fever. Lincoln watched helplessly as the sickness took her life. When Anne died, Lincoln completely fell apart. He was found weeping uncontrollably under a large banyan tree near her cabin. The grief was so heavy and consuming that his friends feared for his mind. He visited her grave constantly. In just a handful of years, he had lost his business, faced political defeat, drowned in debt, and now he had lost the absolute love of his life. New Salem was slowly becoming a ghost town. Carrying a broken heart, Lincoln packed his bags. He left the village behind forever and moved to the nearby city of Springfield to become a lawyer. He had been beaten down by life over and over again, but the boy who had witnessed the horrors of the slave market was not dead. The fires of his failures were slowly forging the man who was preparing to change history. In the dead of night, in February 1861, a train quietly rolled toward Washington, D.C. Inside sat the newly elected President of the United States, sneaking into his own capital city like a hunted fugitive. Abraham Lincoln's security team had uncovered a terrifying plot. Assassins were planning to stab him to death as he passed through the city of Baltimore. To save his life, his guards forced him to change trains in complete secrecy. When the newspapers found out about this secret train ride, they destroyed him. Reporters who supported the South drew cruel cartoons showing the towering president hiding behind train seats, trembling with fear. They called him a coward who was unfit to lead. But Lincoln swallowed his pride. He knew he was walking into the greatest nightmare in American history, and he needed to stay alive to face it. By the time Lincoln stood up to take his oath of office, the United States was already tearing itself apart. The southern states refused to accept him as their president. Their entire way of life, from their massive cotton fields to their tobacco farms, relied heavily on the brutal system of slavery. The northern states, however, were building factories and moving away from slave labor. The South feared Lincoln would take away their slaves, so before he even moved into the White House, 11 southern states broke away. They formed their own country, calling themselves the Confederate States of America. In his very first speech as president, Lincoln begged the South to stay peaceful. He warned them that he would not start a war, but if violence happened, it would be their fault. The South answered by firing cannons at a U.S. military base called Fort Sumter. The American Civil War had officially begun. At first, nobody understood how horrible this war was going to be. In fact, people treated it like a game. When Lincoln ordered his troops to march into Virginia for the first major fight, the Battle of Bull Run, hundreds of wealthy politicians and citizens actually rode out in fine carriages. They brought picnic baskets, sandwiches, and wine, expecting to sit on a nearby hill and watch a quick, glorious victory. Instead, they witnessed a total slaughter. The Union Army was absolutely crushed by the Southern rebels. The deafening blast of cannons and the terrifying screams of the wounded sent a shockwave of panic through the Northern troops. Terrified young soldiers dropped their rifles and ran for their lives, crashing right into the horrified spectators who were trying to escape back to Washington. Lincoln stayed awake all night, questioning the bleeding, exhausted soldiers as they stumbled back into the city. He quickly realized a painful truth. His commanding generals looked incredibly handsome in their crisp uniforms, but they had no idea how to fight a modern, bloody war. They were too slow, too cautious, and terrified of the brilliant Southern commander, General Robert E. Lee. So, Lincoln did exactly what he had done his entire life when he faced a problem he didn't understand. He taught himself. Just as he had taught himself to read by the firelight and taught himself the law to become a lawyer, Lincoln went to the Library of Congress. He checked out stacks of books on military strategy. He sat at his desk, reading late into the night, teaching himself how to command an army. He began firing his hesitant generals one by one, taking emergency control of the country. But as the blood flowed on the battlefields, a different kind of nightmare entered the White House. In 1862, Lincoln's beloved 11-year-old son, Willie, fell incredibly sick. He had caught typhoid fever, the exact same terrifying disease that had killed Lincoln's first great love, Anne Rutledge, many years before in New Salem. Despite the best efforts of the doctors in Washington, young Willie died. Lincoln was completely shattered. He locked himself in a private room and wept uncontrollably for hours. His wife, Mary, was so devastated that her mind never fully recovered from the shock. But Lincoln did not have the luxury of grieving. Carrying the crushing weight of a broken heart and a broken country, he wiped his tears, stepped out of the room, and went back to work. He had to. General Robert E. Lee was marching his rebel army directly toward Washington. The two massive armies clashed in September 1862 at the Battle of Antietam. It was a nightmare of gunfire and cannon smoke. To this day, it remains the single bloodiest day in American military history. Nearly 23,000 men were killed or wounded in just a matter of hours. The fighting was so fierce that nearby rivers literally ran red with human blood. But despite the heavy losses, the Union Army held its ground, forcing General Lee to retreat back to the South. It was the victory Lincoln so desperately needed. 6 days after the smoke cleared at Antietam, Lincoln sat at his desk and pulled out his pen. He was finally in a position of power to do what he had always wanted to do. He was ready to keep the promise he made to himself as a 19-year-old boy, standing in the horrible slave markets of New Orleans. He signed a document called the Emancipation Proclamation. It officially declared that all slaves in the rebel states were now and forever free. As he signed his full name, his hand was trembling slightly because he had been shaking hands with visitors all morning. But his mind was perfectly clear. He looked up and said, "If my name ever goes into history, it will be for this act." With the stroke of a pen, Abraham Lincoln changed the entire meaning of the Civil War. It was no longer just a political fight to keep the country glued together. It was now a holy war to destroy the chains of slavery forever. But the South was not going to give up without a fight to the bitter end, and the final chapter of Lincoln's life was about to unfold. In the early months of 1865, Abraham Lincoln had a terrifying nightmare. He dreamt he was walking through the empty halls of the White House. From every room, he heard the sounds of people crying. Following the tears, he walked into the East Room and saw a body wrapped in a white sheet, its face completely covered. Guards and mourners surrounded it. In his dream, Lincoln walked up to a guard and asked, "Who died in the White House?" The guard looked at him and said, "The president. An assassin murdered him." At that exact moment, the crying in the dream grew so loud that Lincoln woke up. By this time, Lincoln was used to death threats. Ever since he took office, he had received so many angry letters that he kept them all in a special wooden box labeled assassins. His friends begged him to take his safety seriously. They placed armed guards around the White House. But Lincoln used to say that if someone truly wanted to kill him, no amount of armor or guards could stop them. There were simply too many ways to kill a man. Despite the heavy threats, the spring of 1865 finally brought a reason to smile. The Union Army had captured the rebel capital of Richmond, Virginia. Just days later, the brilliant Southern commander, General Robert E. Lee, finally surrendered. The bloodiest war in American history, which had claimed over 600,000 lives, was finally over. Lincoln now faced a massive question. How should he punish the rebels who had ripped the country apart? 2 days after the surrender, Lincoln gave a speech from a White House window. As he read from his notes, he dropped the papers one by one to his young son, Tad, who was sitting at his feet. Someone in the angry crowd yelled out, "What should we do with the rebels? Hang them!" But before Lincoln could speak, little Tad looked up and said, "No, we must hang on to them." Lincoln smiled. His son had perfectly captured his own heart. Lincoln decided to pardon the rebel soldiers. He wanted to heal this broken nation, not punish it further. On April 14, 1865, Lincoln woke up feeling happier than he had in 4 long years. He told his wife, Mary, that the darkness of the war was fading and it was time for them to finally be happy again. That evening, the President and First Lady went out to see a famous comedy play at Ford's Theater in Washington. They sat in a special, decorated box high above the stage. Below them, the crowd cheered, and the orchestra played joyful music to welcome the president. Lincoln sat in his rocking chair, laughing at the jokes on stage, his wife sitting happily by his side. Outside their private box, a single police officer was supposed to be guarding the door. But the officer got bored. He left his post, walked down into the theater, and found a seat to watch the play. The door was left completely unguarded. Waiting in the shadows was a famous stage actor named John Wilkes Booth. Booth was a fierce supporter of the South who hated Lincoln for ending slavery and winning the war. Seeing his chance, Booth silently opened the door behind the president. He stepped inside, pulled out a small pistol, and shot Abraham Lincoln in the back of the head. Lincoln slumped forward instantly. His wife screamed. Before anyone could stop him, Booth slashed another man in the box with a knife and jumped 12 feet down onto the stage below. He yelled out to the stunned crowd that the South was avenged, then ran out the back door and escaped into the night on a horse. The theater erupted into pure chaos. Doctors rushed into the president's box, but it was too late. The bullet was lodged deep in Lincoln's brain. Soldiers carefully carried his tall, unconscious body across the street to a small boarding house. Because he was so tall, they had to lay him diagonally across the bed. The next morning, on April 15, 1865, Abraham Lincoln took his last breath. A government official standing by his bed bowed his head and whispered, "Now he belongs to the ages." The entire nation was plunged into deep mourning. Black soldiers proudly marched beside his coffin to the beat of muffled drums. A special funeral train carried his body on a slow, 2-week journey back to his hometown of Springfield, Illinois. The train passed through 7 states and 180 cities. Millions of Americans lined the train tracks, lighting massive bonfires in the dark just to say a final goodbye to the man who saved their country.